So first and foremost, but I have to say though, that if we want to understand the future of consciousness, we need to study the new ways that we communicate in the present. And if we want to understand the present, we need to put it into a historical context. At some time in the distant and unremembered past, we or our evolutionary ancestors developed spoken language, and at some point we interiorized speech, which became a new form of thought and the basis of a new form of consciousness. We internalize speech, we also internalize the speaker, the other human beings that we interact with. Later, when writing was invented, at first it was just a means of recording the spoken word, but eventually writing was interiorized, giving rise to a new form of consciousness, a literate consciousness. It's a point I made earlier, but let me expand upon it. Before writing, words only existed as energy, as dynamic, ephemeral sound. After writing, words became fixed, static objects, nouns instead of verbs. In this way, we stopped talking and thinking like Hopi and started to become Westerners. As Eric Havelock put it, writing separates the knower from the known. As we put our words and therefore our thoughts down on paper, they become separate from ourselves, distanced and frozen, available to be viewed and reviewed. We can examine our thoughts as if they belong to someone else. We can actually study our minds in this fashion. Writing leads to entirely new levels of self-consciousness. But as Freud argues, it's at the price of repressing other parts of our consciousness into the unconscious mind. Literacy is isolating. When we listen all together as a group. When we read alone, even if we all read the same text. Literacy disrupts our sense of tribal identity and leads us to see ourselves as individuals, unique, alien, and alienated. We come to think of consciousness as a private affair and lose touch with that concept of collective consciousness. Only a highly literate mind could conceive of consciousness as an isolated island of subjectivity or a hopeless prisoner of solipsism. And it's no accident that those philosophical movements materialized after the invention of the printing press, after the printing revolution in Europe. Literate consciousness distances us from the human life world and from our fellow human beings. As writers and readers, we confront the paradox that in order to communicate in this fashion, we require solitude, isolation. Literate consciousness also involves internalizing new roles, creating new selves. As On likes to say, the writer's audience is always a fiction, which is to say that the writer must construct a new kind of generalized other, the reader. On also notes that the reader's writer is equally fictional, as we construct our own sense of the writer that we're reading, and internalize the role of the writer for ourselves. As literacy becomes fully interiorized, writing turns more and more inward towards the exploration of the mind. This is what the development of the novel is all about. The shift from telling stories about agents performing actions to the interior examination of the individual consciousness. And as Ong has noted, it's no accident that Freud's depth psychology follows the development of the modern novel. That Freud discovers the unconsciousness and analyzes the complexities of consciousness only after fiction writers have turned inward. Freud was a product of the high point of literate culture, the moment just before it was overthrown by the new electronic media. And is it any wonder that Alfred Korzybski was introducing his non-Aristotelian system at just about the time that radio and film had come to dominate our collective consciousness? Aristotle is very much a product of the old literate consciousness, which is also characterized by highly abstract thinking. His teacher Plato was one of the first to think in so highly abstract a manner. And in the same way that the first thoughts were mistakenly thought to be voices from beyond, the first high-level abstractions were mistakenly thought to be more real than our everyday reality. Plato was unable to recognize the figments of his own literate imagination. And that's why he arrived at his notion of ideal forms. And in the same way, as letter follows letter, word follows word, and line follows line on the page, writing fosters a linear, one step at a time mode of thought. And this linear approach is the basis of Aristotle's logic. Also, his efforts at categorization are another example of the interiorization of writing's properties. Imagine this situation. Let's say we keep lists. You know, we work for the king, we keep lists, make lists to keep track of his stuff. And you can imagine what happens if any of his stuff is missing. Okay? So we start out by making one long list of all of his stuff, but that becomes unmanageable for accounting, so we start to break it down into sublists, subcategories. And then one guy who's taking inventory one day gets a little confused. And he says, okay, one list says livestock, another says pets. Okay? But there's this duck, you see, and this duck is livestock, but the king treats it like a pet. So I'm going to write it down in both places. Well, if somebody else, maybe a supervisor, is saying, you idiot, if you put the duck down twice, then they're going to count it twice, and they're going to think that there's a duck missing. And who are they going to blame? They're going to blame us, and they're going to cut our heads off for doing this. And so, no double listing. Either you put an item on one list or on another, but not both. And this becomes interiorized over time as the laws of non-contradiction and the laws of the excluded middle. They become part of the thinking process that we know as Aristotle's logic, which Korzybski then turns around and rejects.